They brought a bulldozer to demolish my lake ranch house, all because I supposedly missed an HOA fees payment. A payment for an HOA I never knew existed. I stood there, watching my wife's last wish get turned into a pile of splintered wood while the HOA president just smirked from her golf cart. She thought she was taking everything from me. What she didn't know is that while she was busy forging paperwork to steal my little piece of land, she never checked the one map that shows I own the entire county. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, because this revenge is about to get biblical. And if you believe no HOA should ever get away with this kind of power-hungry abuse, hit subscribe. You need to see the moment they realized they built their kingdom on my property. The sound came first. A low, grinding growl that didn't belong to the morning birds or the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. I was on the porch of my small cottage, the one I'd been living in since Ellie passed, cradling a mug of black coffee. It was still dark, that soft gray light just before dawn. The sound grew, a deep-throated rumble of diesel and steel that made the ceramic in my hands vibrate. I stood up, my old joints creaking in protest, and walked to the edge of the porch. Through the thinning mist, I saw it. A yellow bulldozer, its massive blade already lowered, was chewing through the wall of the ranch house. The ranch house, our ranch house, the one I'd built with my own 2 hands, from plans Ellie had sketched on a napkin one summer evening. Splintered 2x4s and shattered glass exploded into the air. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers and shattered on the stone pavers, the hot liquid scalding my ankle. I didn't even feel it. I started running, or what passes for running, for a 68-year-old man with a bad knee. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I screamed, my voice raw and thin against the roar of the machine. The operator in the cab couldn't hear me, or didn't care to. He was just a guy in a hard hat, doing a job. But the woman watching from a pristine white golf cart, parked just beyond the property line, she heard me. Karen Brennerman, the chairwoman of the Lakeshore Bend Homeowners Association, an HOA I had no part of. My land was grandfathered in decades before this manicured subdivision was even a thought. Karen watched me, a tight, satisfied smile on her face. She held a clipboard like a scepter. She didn't move as I stumbled to a stop a few feet from her, breathing hard, my eyes locked on the wreckage of my life. The west wall, where Ellie's favorite armchair used to sit by the window, collapsed inward with a sickening crunch. "Karen," I gasped. "What is this? You can't do this." She adjusted her visor, her expression unchanging. "We can, Mr. Reeves. And we are. You failed to pay your HOA fees." I stared at her, the words not making any sense. "Fees? I'm not in your HOA. This property has been in my family for 60 years. She tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "According to a recently activated clause in the original developer's transfer agreement, your parcel was absorbed into the Lakeshore Bend jurisdiction last year. Notices were sent. I never got a notice. I never got a letter. I never got anything. I was never informed," I said, my voice shaking with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. "Absorbed? That's not how property law works." The bulldozer slammed its blade into the porch, the one where Ellie and I used to watch the sunsets. The railing splintered. The wildflowers she'd planted along the walkway, her last good project before the cancer took her strength, were churned into the mud beneath the machine's treads. "Your outstanding balance was $386.52, Karen said, her voice dripping with condescending precision. The accumulated fines for non-compliance, however, brought the total to $31,000. Plus demolition and cleanup costs, of course. $386. They were tearing down a lifetime for less than the cost of a decent lawnmower. My hands clenched into fists. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling on the screen, and called the county clerk's office. The woman on the other end was polite but unhelpful. No demolition orders. No liens. Nothing on file for my address. Then get someone out here, I yelled into the phone. They're tearing down my house. I called the sheriff next. It felt like an eternity before a cruiser finally rolled up. A deputy, I knew vaguely, Rick Vansky, got out of the car, slow and deliberate, adjusting his belt. He ambled over, his eyes glancing at the destruction and then at Karen, who gave him a familiar, chummy little wave. I tried to explain, my words tumbling over each other. My property? No notice. The HOA. The bulldozer. Vansky listened with a bored expression, then turned to Karen. She handed him a sheaf of papers from her clipboard. He scanned them, his lips moving silently. Then he looked at me and shrugged. A single, gut-wrenching shrug that told me everything I needed to know. Looks like they got the paperwork in order, Jack, he said, handing the papers back to her. This is a civil matter. You'll have to take it up with your lawyers. Civil matter. My home, the sacred ground where I could still feel my wife's presence, was being illegally demolished, and it was a civil matter. Vansky got back in his car. As he drove away, Karen looked at me, her smile widening into a triumphant grin. You should really learn to read your mail, Mr. Reeves, she said, before signaling to her driver. The golf cart whirred away, leaving me alone in a cloud of dust and despair. I stood there until the last wall came down, until all that was left was a heap of broken timber, twisted pipes, and shattered memories. The demolition crew packed up and left. The silence that followed was louder than the noise. I walked through the debris, picking up a piece of the floral wallpaper from what was once our bedroom. I could still smell Ellie's perfume on it, faint and floral. That's when the shock finally gave way to something else, something hard and cold and focused. They hadn't just knocked down a building, they had declared war. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, but that evening I drove to the county records office just before it closed. I didn't know what I was looking for. A clue, a mistake, anything. I pulled the property records for my land and the surrounding parcels, my engineer's mind taking over, looking for patterns, for anomalies. And then I found it. Buried deep in the digital archives, a single line entry from 18 months ago, a minor property line adjustment, filed on a Tuesday. It ceded a tiny, insignificant sliver of land from an old, defunct developer's portfolio to the Lakeshore Bend HOA. It was the legal linchpin for their claim. The document was digitally signed. The signature wasn't mine, it wasn't the developer's, and the notary stamp was backdated. They had planned this. They had forged a document to create a lie, and used that lie to wipe my world off the map. A cold, quiet certainty settled over me. Karen Brennerman thought she had won. She thought she had taken my home. She had no idea I was about to take her entire world apart, piece by piece. The rage didn't burn hot. It settled in my bones like a winter chill. I spent the next morning not at the wreckage of my home, but knocking on doors in the Lakeshore Bend subdivision. These were people I'd only ever waved to, folks living in cookie-cutter houses with perfectly manicured lawns. I started with the house closest to my property line, a retired couple named the Hendersons. When I explained what had happened, Mr. Henderson's face went pale. He invited me in, and his wife brought out a folder of their own paperwork. "We got a letter a few months back," she said, her voice a nervous whisper. "Something about a new fee schedule. We thought it was just the usual nonsense. They too were part of the HOA, but they'd just paid the extra $100 a month to avoid trouble. They had no idea their property, like mine, was supposed to be independent of the HOA's grip. It was the same story at the next house, and the one after that. A dozen families, all ensnared in the same quiet takeover. The story started to piece itself together. A big developer from the city had bought up the land years ago, but went nearly bankrupt during the last downturn. On his deathbed, looking to unload assets, he'd signed a blanket transfer agreement, flipping dozens of unincorporated lots to the HOA in a single, shady transaction. The clause that allowed it was buried on page 94 of a 100-page document nobody had ever read. We'd all been legally hijacked, and Karen Brennerman was the pirate captain. That flicker of hope, that I wasn't alone, felt like something I could build on. If we all challenged it, maybe we stood a chance. I found the name of a top land use attorney in the city and called him. The man listened to my story for exactly 3 minutes before cutting me off. Sounds like a fraudulent conveyance, Mr. Reeves, but a difficult one. The initial filing fee to even get a judge to look at it will be $10,000. That doesn't include my retainer or billable hours, which will likely reach 6 figures before this is over. $10,000. It might as well have been $1 million. The system wasn't built to find the truth. It was built to reward whoever had the deepest pockets. I hung up the phone feeling emptier than before. The next day, a certified letter arrived at my cottage. It was from the HOA, printed on thick, expensive-looking paper. It formally notified me that due to the demolition of the unapproved structure on their property, I was hereby forbidden from setting foot on the land again. Any attempt to do so would be considered criminal trespass. They were threatening to have me arrested for walking on the ground my grandfather had bought. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words on the letter burned in my mind. Trespass on my own land. Around 2 a.m, I drove out to the lake, parking my truck down the road and walking the rest of the way through the woods, like a thief. I stood at the edge of the flattened dirt patch that used to be my life. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and sawdust. My eyes adjusted to the moonlight, and I started walking the perimeter. And that's when I saw it. Tucked behind an old oak tree, almost hidden in the brush, was a small wooden stake with a bright orange flag on it. A surveyor's stake. I knelt, my bad knee screaming in protest, and pulled it from the soft ground. Scratched into the side, in rough pencil, was a date from 2 weeks before the supposed HOA vote. 2 weeks. They hadn't just taken advantage of a legal loophole. They had been planning this demolition, surveying the land for their attack, long before they even had the fake legal authority to do so. This wasn't business. This was a targeted execution. The next morning, I called Mitch Hardy. Mitch and I go back 40 years, back to when we were both working on city infrastructure projects. He's a retired inspector who can spot fraudulent paperwork from 100 yards away. I sent him a photo of the backdated document I'd found in the county records. He called me back in less than an hour. "It's forged, Jack," he said, his voice a low grumble. "The signatory is a rubber stamp scan, and the geodetic survey marker referenced in the notes wasn't installed until 6 months after the filing date. It's a complete fabrication. They built their entire case on a lie." I thanked him and hung up. The confirmation didn't bring relief. It just poured more fuel on the cold fire inside me. I walked back into my little rental cottage, and my eyes fell on the last picture I had of Ellie. It was taken on the deck of the ranch house, the summer before she got sick. She was smiling, holding up a ridiculously large tomato from her garden, with the lake sparkling behind her. Every beam of that house, every nail, held a memory of that smile. And they had turned it all to garbage. In a sudden, white-hot flash of grief and fury, I snatched the photo, crumpled it into a tight ball in my fist, and threw it against the wall. The sound of the frame cracking echoed the breaking inside me. I sank into a chair, my head in my hands, defeated. They had all the money, all the lawyers, and a corrupt system on their side. They had taken my past and were threatening my future. I had nothing left to fight with. And then, I remembered. It was a memory from my father, from long before the subdivisions and golf carts. A story about the land. I stood up, walked over to a heavy oak chest in the corner, and unlocked it with a small, antique brass key. The chest was filled with my old Army Corps of Engineers manuals and Ellie's gardening journals. But beneath all that, wrapped in oilcloth, was a surveyor's map. It was old, the paper thick and yellowed, drawn in my grandfather's meticulous hand in the 1950s. It showed our property, the lake, the surrounding tracts of undeveloped land. But it also showed something else, marked in faded red ink. A series of lines and notations that weren't on any modern map. When my grandfather sold off the surrounding parcels to the original developer, he was a smart, cautious man. He sold the surface rights. He never, ever sold the mineral rights or the utility easements. I ran my finger over the lines. An underground water main that fed the entire future Lakeshore Bend development. The path for the main electrical trunk line. The sole access road. They all ran, legally and indisputably, through my land. They had demolished my house, but they had built their entire community on my foundation, and they had no idea. For the first time since the bulldozer arrived, I slept. Not well, but it was sleep. The next morning I drove into town and met a buddy of mine, Mike Callahan, for breakfast. Mike's a fellow vet who runs a small utility contracting business. Over greasy eggs and weak coffee, I laid out the old map. I didn't tell him the whole story, just the part that mattered. "Mike," I said, pointing to a faded red line, "this is the water main for the Lakeshore Bend development, right?" He squinted at it, then nodded. "Yep, main feeder. Comes in off the county line, right through the old Reeves parcel." He took a sip of his coffee. "Why?" I tapped a specific point on the map where the line crossed onto my property. "Did the HOA ever get a formal easement recorded when they built this thing out?" Mike chuckled. A dry, rasping sound. "Hell no. They got a handshake deal with the old developer. Buried it in the build permits. Nobody's ever looked at it since. As far as the county is concerned, it's all private lines once it leaves the main road." I folded the map. The confirmation was all I needed. The magnificent Lakeshore Bend clubhouse, with its Olympic-sized swimming pool and perfectly green golf course, was drinking my water. And their only legal access road, the one with the big fancy stone entrance, cut across a 10-foot sliver of land that was still, unequivocally, mine. Karen Brennerman hadn't just trespassed on my property. She'd built her entire kingdom on it. A different man might have acted immediately. Sent the lawyers in, guns blazing. But I learned patience in the core. You don't win a war with one big charge. You win it by controlling the supply lines and choosing your battlefield. So, I waited. I became a ghost. I spent my days gathering intelligence. I'd park my old truck down the road and watch the comings and goings of Lakeshore Bend. I got a small digital voice recorder and a camera with a good zoom lens. My new hobby was documenting the reign of Queen Karen. I recorded her screaming at a teenage kid for skateboarding on the sidewalk, threatening his parents with a $500 fine. I filmed her measuring a neighbor's lawn with a tape measure, clipboard in hand, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. I collected copies of the violation notices she sent out like confetti. Fines for garbage cans, left out an hour too long. For American flags, hung vertically instead of horizontally. For unapproved garden gnomes. She was a petty tyrant, building a monument to her own irrelevance, one absurd rule at a time. The residents were terrified of her. They'd scurry inside when her golf cart came humming down the street. It was a community living under a polite, suburban occupation. And I was documenting every single war crime. After 2 weeks of this, I decided it was time to give them one last chance to do the right thing. It wasn't about hope. It was about procedure. I needed to show I had exhausted every peaceful option before I brought down the hammer. I requested a hearing with the HOA board to appeal the demolition. They granted me 5 minutes at their next monthly meeting. I walked into the clubhouse, the one built on my land and fed by my water. The air was cool and smelled of chlorine and lemon cleaner. The room was full of Karen's loyalists, a half-dozen board members with the same smug, entitled look. Sandra Loomis, the board's compliance officer, sat beside Karen, her pen poised over a notepad. I stood before them at a cheap folding table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show any emotion. I simply laid out my case. I presented the deed to my land, clear and free of any HOA covenants. I showed them a copy of the forged document from the county records, pointing out the chronological impossibilities Mitch had identified. I explained, calmly, that the entire legal basis for their actions was a fraud. When I finished, the room was silent. Karen stared at me, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, she laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a short, sharp bark of contempt. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity, "we have binders full of legal documents. You have a conspiracy theory." She gestured to the papers in my hand. "The board has already reviewed and approved the transfer. This matter is closed." Sandra Loomis chimed in, her voice thin and reedy. "If you continue to make these baseless accusations, Mr. Reeves, the board will be forced to consider filing a harassment suit against you." They weren't just dismissing me, they were enjoying it. They loved the power, the feeling of crushing someone they saw as beneath them. The other board members smirked, nodding in agreement. They were a pack of jackals and I was supposed to be their meal. I gathered my papers, my hands steady. I looked Karen directly in the eye. "Thank you for your time," I said, my voice as calm as the surface of the lake at dawn. I turned and walked out of the room, their condescending chuckles following me out the door. I didn't go back to my truck. I walked around the side of the clubhouse, my footsteps silent on the perfectly manicured grass. I found what I was looking for behind a row of neatly trimmed hedges, a large gray utility box, an electrical transformer. I knew from the old county utility plans that this particular box controlled the power to the non-essential water pumps for the clubhouse and irrigation system. It had been installed, without a permit, and without my permission, squarely on my utility easement. I pulled out my phone and dialed Mike Callahan. "Hey Mike, it's Jack," I said, keeping my voice low. "You remember that transformer box I told you about? The one they built on my land?" There was a pause on the other end. "Yeah, I remember," he said. "What about it?" I looked back at the clubhouse, where the lights were still on, where Karen and her cronies were probably congratulating themselves on their victory. "Flip it off," I said. A long silence followed. Then Mike's voice. Quiet, but clear. "Consider it done." The week began with a whimper. It started on Monday morning, in the master bathroom of a 6-bedroom mini-mansion on Lakeshore Drive. A man trying to rinse the shampoo from his hair found his $1,000 rain shower head suddenly producing a pathetic drizzle. Across the subdivision, the same thing was happening. Toilets took forever to refill. Dishwashers sputtered. The intricate sprinkler systems that kept the lawns a perfect, uniform green coughed out a few weak streams and then went silent. The illusion of control in Lakeshore Bend was fragile, and it was held together by water pressure. By Tuesday, the whispers started. The pristine crystal blue water of the community pool began to take on a cloudy greenish tint as the main circulation pumps, starved of power, fell silent. The imposing security gates at the front entrance, which had been programmed to close automatically, were now stuck wide open, an invitation to anyone who wanted to drive through. Karen Brennerman was, by all accounts, frantic. She was seen zipping around in her golf cart, barking into her phone, her perfectly composed mask beginning to crack. She called the city water department, demanding they send a crew out immediately. I can just imagine the tone of her voice, dripping with entitlement and condescension. The clerk on the other end of the line, a woman who had probably dealt with 100 Karens, was unmoved. After putting her on hold for 5 minutes, the clerk came back. "Ma'am, our telemetry shows full pressure up to the subdivision's main valve. The problem is on your side of the meter. It's private infrastructure." Karen, I was told later, slammed the phone down. She called the utility company next. Same story. Power was flowing to the main junction. The problem was inside her little kingdom. By Wednesday, the murmuring among the residents had grown into a low roar. An angry father, whose kids could no longer use the now swampy pool, posted a video to the local community Facebook group. He stood in front of the murky water, pointing his phone at the pathetic trickle coming from the decorative fountain. This is what $600 a month gets you? He said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A science experiment? I pay my dues on time, every time, and for what? The gates are broken, the sprinklers are dead, and the pool looks like a sewer. What are we paying you for, Karen? The video had 1,000 views in a few hours. The comments were brutal. That's when my letter arrived. I had it delivered by a professional process server, a big, intimidating guy, who handed the envelope directly to Karen on the front steps of the clubhouse. It wasn't an angry letter. It was calm, professional, and deadly. Written on the letterhead of a property management LLC I'd formed overnight, it was a formal notice of easement enforcement. It cited the legal code for utility and access encroachment. It referenced the original parcel maps from 1958, copies of which were attached. It explained in very simple terms that the HOA's primary water, electrical, and access infrastructure was trespassing on my private property. It gave them 7 days to either remove all their equipment or begin negotiating a fair market lease for its continued use. Failure to comply, the letter stated, would result in the termination of all access. I didn't sign it with my name. I signed it as the managing member of the holding company that now officially owned the rights. They weren't dealing with old Jack Reeves anymore. They were dealing with a corporation. Karen lost her mind. She called an emergency HOA meeting for Friday night. I didn't attend, but I heard all about it. The clubhouse was packed. The residents were angry and confused, waving copies of their water bills and my letter. Karen stood at the podium, her face blotchy and red. She tried to project authority, but her voice was shrill. She called me a disgruntled squatter. She called my claims baseless. And then, she made the mistake I had been waiting for. Cornered and panicked, she started screaming. Someone in the back had their phone out, recording everything. "This is an act of terrorism!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This man is trying to extort this community. He is a criminal, and we will not negotiate with terrorists." The video was on the local news station's website by Saturday morning. The headline read, "HOA President Accuses Local Veteran of Terrorism Over Property Dispute." The court of public opinion was now in session. While Karen was busy having her public meltdown, I was having a much quieter meeting. I met with a man named David Chen, the head of a private development group that had been trying to get a foothold in the area for years. He was sharp, aggressive, and he hated HOAs. We sat on the tailgate of my truck, overlooking the lake. I didn't sell him my main property. I sold him something far more valuable. I sold him a 15-acre parcel of undeveloped woodland I owned on the far side of the lake. A piece of land completely outside the HOA's jurisdiction. It was a nice piece of property, but its real value was in the fine print of the sale. Along with the land, I sold him full, legally deeded rights to build a public boat ramp and park. And with that came permanent, irrevocable access rights to the only deep water channel leading from the main body of the lake to the shore, the same channel the Lakeshore Bend Community Marina used. Their entire sales pitch, their entire reason for being, was built on the promise of exclusive, private lake access. I had just sold the front door to their private lake, and the new owner was about to open it up to the whole world. The notice for the next emergency meeting went out on a Monday. This time, the tone was different. The blustering arrogance was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of corporate jargon about infrastructure challenges and community-wide solutions. They scheduled it for a Wednesday night in the clubhouse ballroom. I wasn't invited, of course, but I decided to go anyway. I didn't dress up. I wore a clean pair of work jeans, a flannel shirt, and a simple ball cap. I walked in just as Karen was starting her speech. The room was packed. Standing room only. Every resident who had ever received a fine or a nasty letter was there. Their faces were a mixture of anger, fear, and confusion. Karen stood at a lectern. A forced, brittle smile plastered on her face, trying to spin the narrative. She was talking about unforeseen complications and exploring options. She never once mentioned my name. I walked down the central aisle, my boots quiet on the thick carpet. A ripple of whispers followed me. Heads turned. The residents knew who I was. Karen's speech faltered as she saw me approaching the front of the room. Her eyes widened, a flicker of panic in their depths. Her second in command, Sandra Loomis, shot me a look of pure hatred. I didn't stop at the front row. I walked right up to the small stage, took a USB stick from my pocket, and plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector. Before anyone could react, I clicked a file. The image of the forged property line adjustment, the one with the backdated signature, filled the giant screen behind Karen's head. I didn't need a microphone. In the dead silent room, my voice carried easily. "That," I said, pointing to the screen, "is a forgery. The foundation of this HOA's claim on my land, and on the land of at least a dozen of your homes, is a criminal act." I clicked to the next slide. It was a timeline. On one side, the date of the forged document. On the other, the date of the public record, showing the survey marker it referenced hadn't existed yet. Simple, clear, undeniable. "They lied," I said, my voice level. I kept clicking. Next up, a detailed map showing the utility easements. I used a laser pointer to trace the path of the water main and the electrical lines running from the county road across my property and into their precious clubhouse. Every drop of water that fills your pool, every watt of electricity that powers this building, crosses my land, without my permission, without a legal easement. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. I saw people looking at each other, the gears turning. I brought up a satellite image next, showing the single, narrow road leading into their subdivision. I zoomed in on the entrance, on the big, ostentatious stone sign that read Lakeshore Bend. I superimposed the property lines from my grandfather's map over the image. A thick red line cut directly across the asphalt. "This road," I said, circling the entrance with the laser pointer, "is also on my land. Your only legal way in or out of this neighborhood belongs to me." Then came the final piece, the cherry on top. I clicked play on a video file. It was the footage I had recorded weeks ago, the one of Karen screaming at a young Hispanic man who worked for a lawn care service. He was a tenant, not a homeowner. She was berating him for parking his work truck on the street, her voice filled with a venom that went far beyond any rule violation. The racial slurs she used were clear, ugly, and shocking. The crowd gasped. Sandra Loomis looked like she was going to be sick. Karen stared at the screen, her face as white as a sheet. When the video ended, I turned to face the residents. It was time for the hero moment, the one I had been playing over and over in my head. I stood up straight, took off my ball cap, and held it in my hands. "I never asked to be a part of your community," I said, my voice resonating with a lifetime of quiet conviction. "I never signed your papers, I never joined your HOA, but I own every inch of dirt, every drop of water, and every pathway you depend on to live here. And starting next Monday morning, I'm shutting it all off. I'm putting a gate on the main road, and I'm capping the water line, unless you vote to disband this HOA, formally, completely, tonight." For a long moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. The residents looked from me to the projector screen, then to the horrified faces of the board members. They were trapped. Their property values, their way of life, it all depended on a man they had allowed their board to victimize. Then, in the back of the room, a single person started clapping. It was the father from the Facebook video. Then another person joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. It wasn't just for me, it was for themselves. It was the sound of 100 people realizing they finally had the power back. Karen Brennerman stood frozen for a second. Then something inside her snapped. "He's lying!" she screamed, her voice a raw, desperate shriek. "He's forging documents! You can't believe him!" She grabbed a heavy 3-ring binder from the lectern, probably her precious book of rules, and hurled it into the crowd. It flew through the air and struck one of her own board members on the side of the head. He staggered back, clutching his face. That was it. The whole thing fell apart. Two men, who I later learned were off-duty cops, stood up and moved toward the stage. As they escorted a screaming, hysterical Karen out of the room, a local news reporter who had followed me in captured the whole chaotic scene on camera. The rain was over. Being publicly humiliated and escorted out by police didn't chasten Karen Brennerman. It just made her more dangerous. A cornered animal is a desperate one. While the remaining HOA board members scrambled to do damage control, calling lawyers and fielding furious calls from residents, Karen launched her final, spiteful attack. That night, every homeowner in Lakeshore Bend received a mass email. The subject line, in all caps, read, "Urgent warning about Jack Reeves." The email was a masterpiece of paranoid fantasy. She claimed I was a convicted felon, a known squatter with a history of property fraud. She said the documents I presented were elaborate forgeries, part of a criminal scheme to seize control of their homes. She painted herself as the brave victim, the lone voice of truth, trying to protect the community from a dangerous predator. It was a pathetic, last-ditch effort to poison the well, to sow enough doubt that she might be able to crawl back into some position of power. But I was ready for it. I had learned from her tactics. While she was typing her lies, I was busy with certified mail. I had already sent complete, notarized copies of every document, the forged deeds, my grandfather's original map, the utility plans, the surveyor's reports from Mitch, to the county prosecutor's office, the sheriff's department, and the investigative team at the local news station. Her email wasn't a warning. It was a confession. Every lie she told was a verifiable count of libel and defamation. She didn't know that, of course. Consumed by her own rage, she made one last, critical mistake. Sometime after midnight, she drove her little white golf cart not to the clubhouse, but down the old access road toward my rental cottage. She must have thought no one would be watching. She probably thought she could get away with one final act of anonymous vandalism, a petty parting shot. But I had my own security now. A couple of small, motion-activated wildlife cameras were strapped to the trees along the path, the kind you use to watch deer, not unhinged former HOA presidents. The infrared camera captured it all in ghostly black and white. The footage showed her parking the cart, her face a mask of fury in the pale light. It showed her pulling a steak knife from her pocket. It showed her kneeling and methodically, viciously, slashing the sidewalls of all four tires on my old Ford F-150. This wasn't a civil matter anymore. This was destruction of property. It was criminal. The moment the sheriff's office received the video file the next morning, everything changed. Deputy Vansky, the same man who had shrugged and called my demolished home a civil issue, suddenly found his spine. With a news camera crew now parked outside his office, he couldn't afford to look incompetent a second time. He personally drove out to Karen's immaculate home and arrested her on her front lawn. The spell was broken. The fear that had held the community in a chokehold for years evaporated with the morning dew. That afternoon, something happened that I never expected. A car pulled into my driveway, one of my neighbors, a man I'd seen her harass over the height of his fence. He got out, holding a six-pack of beer, and walked up to my porch. I just wanted to say, "We didn't know," he said, his voice quiet. "We're sorry." An hour later, another car pulled up. It was a younger guy, a Marine veteran, who had been fined for flying a Marine Corps flag on his porch. He didn't say much. He just handed me a $100 gift card to the local lumber yard for the rebuild, was all he said. All day long, they came. A steady stream of people, stopping by to apologize, to thank me, to offer help. They brought food, tools, and promises. It turned out that a community did exist in Lakeshore Bend. It had just been buried under a mountain of rules and intimidation. One man, a retired contractor, volunteered to help me draw up new plans for the ranch house. A whole crew of vets from the local VFW post offered to help frame it. The iron grip of the HOA had been replaced by the open hand of a neighborhood. The final blow came not with a bang, but with the stroke of a pen. I filed my lawsuit. A massive, multi-count suit against the HOA and every board member, personally, for illegal demolition, fraud, conspiracy, and emotional distress. Their insurance company took one look at the mountain of evidence, the forged documents, the public humiliation, the criminal charges against their president, and immediately balked. They sent a letter to the board stating that since the HOA's actions were based on a fraudulent claim from the start, their policy was void. The board members were now personally on the hook for millions of dollars in damages. They folded instantly. Within a week, the HOA was formally dissolved. As a condition of the settlement, every resident was refunded their last 2 years of dues, and Karen Brennerman, as part of her plea deal to avoid jail time for the vandalism, was forced to stand in front of the local news cameras and issue a formal public apology. I watched it on TV. She read from a prepared statement, her voice flat and dead, the smugness finally gone, replaced by the hollow look of someone who had lost everything. They showed her stepping down from the podium, a disgraced queen, abandoning a kingdom that had never really been hers. The news anchor then cut to a final shot, the rubble of my ranch house, with a newly placed sign out front. It wasn't a no trespassing sign. It was a simple wooden plaque that read, "Future home of Ellie's Walk." A year makes a difference. I'm sitting on my porch again, a mug of black coffee in my hands. The mug is new, a gift from the Hendersons down the street, but the feeling is old, familiar. It's the same morning light, the same soft sound of the lake. But the house at my back is different. It's smaller than the one they took, simpler. It's built solid, with timber milled from trees on my own land. There are no fancy flourishes, no wasted space. It's an engineer's house. But it's not just my house. The frame was raised over a single weekend by a dozen men from the neighborhood, the VFW post, and Mike Callahan's utility crew. The wiring was done by a retired electrician who used to get fined by Karen for having a work van. The plumbing was laid by the Marine whose flag she hated. Every stud and joint in this place is a testament not to what I lost, but to what we all found when the tyranny fell. They didn't just help me rebuild a structure. They helped me rebuild a home. The dirt path that runs along the water's edge is wider now, covered in fine gravel. At the trailhead, just past my new porch, there's a simple hand-carved wooden sign. It says, "Ellie's Walk." The new community committee put it there. After the HOA was dissolved, the residents got together, not to form a new one, but to create something better. It's a voluntary group. No dues, no fines, no power to tell anyone what color they can paint their door. They organize a neighborhood watch. They pool resources to help elderly residents with yard work and home repairs. Last month, they spent a Saturday putting a new roof on the house of a widow whose husband had just passed. They used the leftover funds from the dissolved HOA to do it. The power that Karen had used to torment people was now being used to actually help them. It turns out that when you take the bullies out of the equation, most people just want to be good neighbors. Last weekend, the new public park had its grand opening on the other side of the lake. David Chen, the developer I sold the land to, invited the entire community. He built a beautiful public boat ramp, a fishing pier, and a covered pavilion with barbecue pits. He called it Lakeside Community Park. The first event was a huge cookout. I went, expecting to just blend in, but when I got there, Chen met me at the entrance and walked me up to the front, handing me a pair of oversized scissors to cut the ribbon. He introduced me as the guest of honor. I stood there, looking out at the crowd of faces. I saw kids running around, families setting up picnic blankets. These were the same people who used to look away when I drive by, afraid to be seen talking to the troublemaker. Now they were smiling, waving, The father who posted the viral video of the green pool came up and shook my hand, his kids in tow. "They're catching their first fish over at the pier you made possible," he told me. The exclusive lakefront living that Karen had lorded over everyone was gone. Now, it was just a lake, open for everyone to enjoy. It was better this way. So now I sit here on my porch, a stray mutt I named Gus sleeping at my feet. I watch two kids down at the end of my new dock, the one the retired contractor designed. They're casting their lines into the water, their laughter carrying over the gentle waves. The sun is warm on my face. It feels like peace. They tried to take it all from me, my home, my history, my wife's last gift. They came with bulldozers and bogus documents, thinking their power was absolute because it was written in the fine print of a rulebook they wrote themselves. But I didn't fight them with lawyers, not at first. I didn't fight them with threats. I fought with the truth. I fought with a surveyor's stake and a little map that nobody else had ever bothered to read. They thought they were building an empire, but their foundation was weak because it was built on lies. My foundation was solid because it was built on the dirt my grandfather paid for. Turns out, you don't need to control the board when you already own the land.